The light above us hums like a distant street lamp, too bright to be kind and too steady to be ignored. His hand is warm against my back, steady as if he's anchoring both of us to this narrow, borrowed world. I can feel the slow rise and fall of his chest under my cheek, the little hitch of his breath every time my fingers find the seam of his shirt. Everything else, the tall shelves, the faint smell of old paper, the security camera blinking red in the corner, blurs into music beneath the steady beat of us. We're tangled on a faded sofa that probably hasn't been sat on in years. Someone threw a blanket over the armrest, and it feels ridiculous and perfect, like a secret made our own. My head is tucked under his jaw. The heat between us is too soft to be called a heat, but too bright to ignore. He says my name like an apology and a promise at once, and it makes something in my chest loosen and then pull tight all at once. There are no words for the way his thumb traces circles along my wrist, like he's memorizing me. I'm aware, in that heightened way you only get when your whole body is paying attention, of the tiny noises the library makes. A book sliding back into place, the distant echo of a janitor's cart, the whisper of pages stirred by the air conditioning. They sound intimate here, like accomplices. His breath brushes my ear, and I think of all the moments that led to this hush, the glances that stretched, the jokes that landed with a little too much meaning, the way our shoulders bumped over a pile of overdue returns. I'm dizzy with a delicious, terrible certainty that this will be a night I'll remember forever. My knees are warm against his hip, his fingers curl around mine, and the rest of the world, schedules, exams, everything, folds away until there is only this. Only us and the soft, reckless decision to stay. But to understand how I got here, let me take you back. It started so simply, so mundanely, that sometimes I wonder if the universe had been laughing at me all along. Just another evening on campus. My backpack weighed down with too many notes and not enough motivation. The library had always been my safe place. Quiet corners, the smell of paper and ink, the comforting order of shelves taller than me. I never expected it would become the setting of one of the most unforgettable nights of my life. His name was Dominic. He wasn't new, not exactly. We'd been circling each other for a while, though in that unconscious way people do when their lives orbit in the same places without colliding. He was in my literature seminar, the one with the professor who always demanded more analysis than anyone was willing to give. Dominic always seemed prepared, leaning back in his chair with an easy confidence, answering questions I was too shy to raise my hand for. But what stood out wasn't just his knowledge. It was his presence. He had this habit of pushing his hair back when he was thinking, like his thoughts needed room to breathe. His laugh was soft, not loud, but warm enough that people leaned toward him when they heard it. I didn't admit it to anyone, not even my closest friend, but whenever he spoke, I found myself watching, listening, memorizing. The library was where our paths finally started to overlap. We weren't friends, not yet, but somehow, we always seemed to end up in the same section. Sometimes I'd look up from my notebook and see him 3 tables away, frowning at his laptop, headphones in. Other times, I'd be shelving books for my work-study shift and catch sight of him wandering the aisles, one hand sliding absently along the spines. There was one night I remember so clearly. I was in the philosophy aisle, reaching for a book on the very top shelf. My arms weren't quite long enough, and just as I was considering giving up, a taller figure reached past me with effortless grace. Dominic. He plucked the book down like it was nothing, handed it to me, and smiled in that casual way that made my heart skip. "You always go for the hardest reads," he said, tilting the book in my direction. "And you always appear right when I need help," I managed to reply, trying not to sound breathless. It was such a small moment, just a shared smile in a quiet corner, but it stayed with me longer than it should have. After that, I started noticing him more. He was the kind of person who filled a room without trying, who leaned against a wall like he belonged there. Sometimes, when I passed him in the hallway, I'd catch his eyes flicking toward me, quick but undeniable. And sometimes, when I dared to hold that glance, he wouldn't look away immediately. It was enough to set my imagination spinning. I'd find myself replaying those brief moments late at night when the dorm was quiet, wondering if I'd imagined it all. By mid-semester, the library had turned into more than a study space. It was where I secretly hoped I'd see him. Where I half wondered if he'd noticed that I lingered in the aisles. He always seemed to wander. The truth was, I liked the safety of distance. It was easier to admire him from afar, to let myself daydream without risking rejection. But deep down, a part of me wanted more, a chance to know if the energy I felt between us was real or just something I'd made up in my head. And little did I know, that chance was waiting for me on one late night that neither of us could have planned for. The first time I realized something was different between us wasn't one grand, dramatic moment. It was subtle. So subtle that if I hadn't been paying attention, I might have missed it. But my heart didn't. It caught every little shift, every glance, every pause that lingered a beat too long. It was late one Thursday. The library was unusually quiet, even for a weeknight. I had claimed a table near the tall windows, papers spread everywhere in a hopeless attempt to look organized. I remember rubbing my temples, trying to focus, when I heard the scrape of a chair. Dominic. He sat down across from me, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. My pulse jumped, but I forced myself to look casual, sliding one paper over another. "Mind if I sit here?" he asked, though he was already setting his books down. I shook my head. Not at all. My voice was steadier than I felt. At first, we didn't talk much. The quiet between us wasn't awkward. It was charged. Every so often, I'd glance up and catch him watching me, a small curve tugging at the corner of his mouth before he'd drop his gaze again. Once, I caught myself staring at the way his fingers tapped absent-mindedly against the cover of his notebook, steady, rhythmic. Then came the first touch. I dropped my pen. It rolled across the table, of course, right toward him. He picked it up and handed it back, but as he did, his fingers brushed mine. Just a second, nothing more. But that single spark shot straight through me, and I felt heat bloom in my cheeks. His eyes lingered on me, like he'd felt it too. He didn't say anything, just smiled softly before returning to his notes. But the silence after that wasn't the same. It wasn't just quiet anymore. It was alive. Another night, I remember leaning over one of the massive anthologies we were both referencing for our seminar. I muttered something about not being able to find a passage, and before I could stop him, Dominic slid his chair closer. "Here," he murmured, his shoulder brushing mine as he pointed to the page. The nearness of him made it impossible to focus on the words. I could smell his cologne, faint and warm, and it made my chest tighten in a way I didn't understand. I nodded, probably too quickly, and whispered, "Thanks." But the strangest part was, he didn't move away immediately. He stayed there, close enough that I could feel the heat of his arm against mine, as if neither of us wanted to break the spell. After that, the small moments kept piling up. The way he'd lean across the table when we worked together, his hand brushing mine as we passed books back and forth. The way he'd glance at me when something funny happened in class, like it was our private joke, even if no one else noticed. The way he started waiting for me outside the seminar room, walking with me toward the library as though it had always been our routine. Once, when a storm rolled in unexpectedly, thunder shaking the windows, I jumped a little. He chuckled softly and said, "You're safe here." His voice was low, reassuring, but it left me reeling, because it didn't feel like he was just talking about the storm. I knew then that something was building between us, something neither of us had named but both of us felt. It was in the way his hand would linger a second longer than necessary when he passed me a book. The way our eyes locked a fraction too long when we said goodnight. These weren't just coincidences anymore. They were sparks. Tiny, undeniable flickers of something waiting to catch fire. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before it did. It was supposed to be just another late-night study session. Exams were looming, and the library had extended hours. I'd settled into my usual corner with a stack of books, the kind that always looked more impressive than they felt useful. A few minutes later, like clockwork, Dominic appeared. He dropped his bag into the chair beside mine without asking. By then, it had become routine, him finding me pretending not to notice how much I liked it. "You're here again," he teased, sliding into the seat. I smirked. "So are you." For a while, it was ordinary. We worked in silence, traded a few whispers, shared a smile when someone's phone went off across the room. Time slipped by unnoticed, the way it always seemed to when he was around. Until suddenly, it was quiet. Too quiet. I looked up, realizing the library had emptied out. The rows of desks were bare, the lamps switched off in sections. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, and that's when the truth sank in. "Oh no," I whispered, sitting up straighter. Dominic followed my gaze. The main doors were shut tight, the metal gate already pulled across. "We're locked in?" I asked, though the answer was obvious. He stood, walked to the entrance, and tugged on the handle just to be sure. The dull rattle echoed back. He turned, an amused smile tugging at his lips. "Guess so." I pressed my hand over my mouth, half in disbelief, half to smother nervous laughter. "This cannot be happening." He walked back slowly, his expression softer now, like the situation wasn't an inconvenience at all, but something else, an opportunity. "Well," he said, dropping back into his chair, "I guess we've got the whole place to ourselves." The words hung in the air. The library, usually so structured and safe, suddenly felt different, intimate, secret, like it belonged only to us. For a while, we tried to act normal. I flipped pages in my book I didn't actually read. He scribbled in his notebook, though I caught him watching me more than once. The quiet pressed closer, thick with something unspoken. Finally, he broke it. "You don't seem too upset about being stuck with me." His voice was low, teasing, but there was something searching in his eyes. I swallowed, my pulse racing. "Maybe. I'm not." The air shifted. His chair scraped as he moved closer, his knee brushing mine under the table. I felt every inch of space closing between us, my heart thrumming like a secret trying to get out. Neither of us said the words outright. We didn't need to. The closeness, the charged silence, the way my breath caught when his fingers brushed against mine on the table, it was all the confession we couldn't voice. And in that moment, locked away from the world, we both stopped pretending. The moment I felt his fingers brush mine on that table, it was as if every wall I'd carefully built around myself cracked at once. The library was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that made every sound echo. The whisper of our breaths, the faint hum of the air vents, the rustle of pages no one was reading anymore. I looked up, and Dominic was already watching me. Not the casual glances I'd grown used to, but steady, unguarded, like he'd finally stopped hiding what had been there all along. My chest tightened. I should have looked away, should have laughed it off. But instead, I let my hand stay where it was. His thumb traced a slow, deliberate line along the back of my hand, and I felt heat coil low in my stomach. "You know," he said quietly, his voice just above a whisper, "I've been waiting for an excuse to be alone with you." The words hit me harder than I expected. My lips parted, but no answer came. My silence must have been enough, because the next thing I knew, his chair scraped softly against the floor, and he was beside me, not across anymore. Everything slowed down. The way his arm brushed mine, the faint electricity in the air, the way my heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. He leaned in, hesitating for just a second, giving me the chance to pull away. But I didn't. When his lips finally touched mine, it felt both shocking and inevitable. Gentle at first, testing, like he wasn't sure how much of himself to give. But when I leaned into him, when I let my fingers tangle in the fabric of his sleeve, something inside both of us gave way. The kiss deepened, no longer tentative but hungry, all the tension of weeks, months, pouring out at once. The table between us was suddenly unbearable. He shifted, pulling me closer, until I was half in his lap, the forgotten book sliding to the floor with soft thuds. My laughter slipped out between kisses. Not because it was funny, but because it was impossible to believe this was real, that the boy I'd been quietly daydreaming about was holding me like this, as if he'd been dreaming the same thing all along. We stumbled back toward one of the old sofas tucked into the far corner, hidden between tall shelves. The cushions sagged under our weight, the fabric scratchy but perfect because it meant we were still close, still tangled in this impossible, reckless moment. His hands were careful but certain, mapping the shape of me like he'd been memorizing from a distance and was finally allowed to touch. Every brush of his fingers sent ripples through me, every soft murmur against my lips grounding me in the reality of it. The library, usually so still and strict, had become something else entirely, a sanctuary for the kind of closeness we'd both been denying. I remember the way he pulled back just once, his forehead resting against mine, his breath uneven. "Tell me if this is too much," he whispered. I shook my head, my voice trembling but sure. "Don't stop." That was all it took. Time lost its shape after that. Minutes, maybe hours, I couldn't tell. All I knew was the feeling of his hands holding me, the way his voice broke softly when he said my name, the warmth of his lips trailing along the edge of my jaw. Everything else, exams, responsibilities, the world beyond the locked doors, ceased to exist. It wasn't rushed, not like the stories I'd read or imagined. It was slow, unwrapping layer after layer of tension, until all that was left was the raw truth of wanting, of finally letting ourselves fall. The air smelled of old books and dust, but all I could breathe was him. At some point, the blanket that had been draped over the arm of the sofa ended up around us, cocooning us in a secret world where nothing and no one could intrude. I felt safe, even as my heart raced faster than it ever had before. Safe and alive and wanted. We moved between laughter and quiet gasps, between playful nudges and desperate clinging. There were moments where I thought I might burst from the sweetness of it all, his smile when he kissed the corner of my mouth, the way his hand tightened gently around mine as if anchoring me. And when finally the frenzy softened, when we lay tangled together under that faded blanket, the silence returned. But it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of every unspoken word, every hidden glance, every small moment that had led us here. His arm was around me steady, his chest rising and falling under my cheek. For the first time in forever, I didn't care about the time, the place, or the consequences. All that mattered was this. The boy I thought I'd never have the courage to reach for was here, holding me like I was the only thing he wanted. And in that quiet, secret corner of the library, I knew my life had changed. The morning light always feels different after a night that changes you. When I woke, it wasn't in a bed, but still curled up on that worn library sofa, the blanket slipping down around my shoulders. For a moment, I forgot where I was, until I felt Dominic's arm still draped over me, his hand resting loosely against my side. His breathing was steady, deep, and the sight of him sleeping so peacefully made something ache in my chest. It all came rushing back. The whispers, the kisses, the way time had folded in on itself until there was only us. My lips tingled just thinking about it, my body still humming with the memory of his closeness. And then reality crept in, soft but unrelenting. The library. The fact that any minute now, the world would return. The doors would unlock, people would come bustling in, and the secret we had woven in the shadows would dissolve into daylight. I eased myself up slowly, not wanting to wake him, but as soon as I shifted, his hand tightened ever so slightly, as if even in sleep, he wasn't ready to let go. That small gesture undid me. My throat tightened, my eyes stung, because it wasn't just last night. It wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was more. I sat there for a long while, watching the sunlight creep across the dusty floor, listening to the muffled sound of someone unlocking the main doors. Panic should have set in, the fear of being caught, of explaining why we were wrapped in a blanket together in the far corner of the library. But what I felt instead was a strange, reckless calm. Because no matter what happened next, nothing could erase what we'd shared. When Dominic finally stirred, His eyes blinked open, still heavy with sleep. He smiled, that soft, crooked smile that had always undone me. "Morning," he whispered, his voice rough but tender. I laughed quietly, brushing hair from my face. "Morning." We didn't talk about what it meant, not right then. We didn't need to. It was in the way he looked at me, like I was no longer just the girl across the table from him. And in the way I felt lighter, like I had finally stepped into the story I'd been too afraid to write. As we walked out of the library together, the world felt the same. Students rushing, books stacking, the buzz of ordinary life. But I wasn't the same. I couldn't be. Because once you've had a night like that, once you've been held like you're the only secret worth keeping, you're never quite the same again. Some nights stay with you forever, etched into your memory like a favorite line from a book you'll never return to the shelf. That night in the library wasn't just about stolen kisses or being locked away from the world. It was about finally letting myself feel what I'd been too afraid to admit. And maybe that's why it lingers so vividly. Tell me, have you ever had a moment you wished would never end? A memory so tender it still makes your heart race when you think about it?